Well, thanks again, guys, and sorry for the issues that we had online, but here we are. We'll just roll with the punches, and this is what we're all working with. So I just want to introduce Toby from Connexus and Warwick from BCITO. For some of you, they might be familiar faces, but it's great to have the two of them here together to bring the two pieces of the puzzle together and see where there could be some ways that we could be working together. And there's also likely going to be some transfer of skills between these two parts of the industry, be it in infrastructure and civil across to construction and building, because there may be a different weighing of where all the work is in the next few years. So the topics for today are, do we have the right skills? Do we have them where we need them? And do we have the right skills for what's coming ahead? And I also just thought we might break the time into perhaps looking at what did we do wrong in the previous, call it 3 to 5 years, where there was just so much talk about a shortage of skills and shortage of the right side of the sort of skills. So what are the lessons learned from that? And then what are we going to do in this kind of downturn or this lull or the shift in direction? How are we going to approach that from a skills side? And how do we prepare ourselves for the next boom so that skills is never going to be the thing that holds the industry back again? So that's kind of where we're going to head. Do you guys just want to give a little bit of a kick-off by giving a bit of a overview about what you do, just in case people don't know who you are, where you're from, and then we'll go back to some learnings from the past few years. Yeah,
great.
Why don't you kick off, Warwick?
Okay, g'day everybody. I'm with the Building and Construction Industry Training Organisation, the BCITO. We cover 15 construction trade sectors. We're the largest provider of skills training in New Zealand. We have about 13,000 active apprentices and trainees in our system at the moment. But construction's covered by about 5 ITOs in total, and there's probably in the order of 25 to 30,000 apprentices in the system altogether when you take into account the other ITOs, of which Toby runs one, and the Polytech sector. So it's not insignificant by any means, the number of people training in construction, but while BCITO has the lion's share, it's spread across a number of organisations.
Oh, Toby.
Great afternoon. Toby Beaglehole Connexus, which is the infrastructure industry training organisation. We cover just 4 sectors. So that's civil, water, telco and ESI. And we've got about 3,000 trainees in total. So as Warwick says, we've got some overlap in a couple of areas with both other ITOs and indeed the Polytechs that are now part of the new New Zealand Institute of Skills and Technology, NZIST. And so as a sector, we are going through our own change, these reforms of vocational education. So I think this discussion is quite timely because we need to be talking about how we all work together better, both in terms of what's gone wrong in the past and what could go right in the future. And I think this is a good conversation to explore some of those options to do things better.
When you guys talk about in training, is that mostly in apprenticeship type roles where they're on site, or is it obviously there's a blend even with an apprenticeship of in class and on site, but that's generally what you're talking about, or how does that work?
Yeah, so in construction for ITOs, you have to be in an employment agreement or in work in order to qualify for funding through the ITO system. Notwithstanding that, there could well be, as part of your on-job teaching and learning, you might need to attend block courses or classrooms to fill any gaps or any particular areas of training that's agreed between us and the wider sector around how that training might take place.
Yeah. Okay.
But you're not a student, as you would be if you were a full-time Polytech or university student. You are a worker.
Yeah. All right, I'm just jotting down questions as we go, so if I look away, that's what I'm doing. I'm not replying to emails and things. Do you guys now want to just talk about what are some of the lessons? What did we get wrong? Where were the shortfalls in the last few years?
Okay, well, I'll kick off. So effectively, we've always been left to market forces to determine our skill needs. And because we're employer focused, we take the lead from the number of firms that are willing to take on trainees or apprentices. And in the past, during all economic recessions, it's been left to supply and demand. And so if there is no work, effectively firms don't take on trainees. And during the global financial crisis, we were lobbying the government of the day to incentivize firms to train or to continue to build a pipeline, even though there's limited work, because we're going to need them on the other side when the economy and the sector recovers. They wouldn't do that. So leaving it in that space was a very blunt instrument. And so we effectively didn't train at all. The entire construction sector organised itself around activity levels that were about, 50% or 60% of what they were, and stayed that way. So we had very low training numbers. When the sector does recover, it takes another year to 2 years for firms to be confident to take on an apprentice because they want that forward work. And so notwithstanding they don't train during a recession and we lose people, we also have a lag at the other end when the economy recovers, by which time we're screaming out for skills because it does bounce pretty quickly. And if you look at our construction cycles, it's extremely boom bust, high peaks, very low lows, and they recover quite quickly. Particularly the residential space, where about 80% of all training in construction is done.
Yeah.
So we're always in catch-up mode as a result of any economic shock like this.
And what about, were there particular skill sets that were really short, like engineering and a lot of that side of things? Seemed, from what I could see, there was just engineering was stuff that you couldn't get an engineer, Yeah. They were all flat out. But were there particular skill sets that were worse than others?
Right across the board, whether it's an academic pathway, a university pathway, a polytech pathway, or a on-job learning pathway, it was right through from just labour, unskilled labour, right through to the top. And I think that's probably the same in your space, Toby.
Yeah, and I think Tim, you referred to engineers and engineering before. The other thing which happens is cannibalisation of expert workers. So you'll get the sectors which may not have been directly impacted suddenly finding that all their mechanical or electrical engineers are being cherry picked off them, and therefore you make the problem wider and worse, which again is something we don't want to see repeated.
Yeah.
One of the other problems we've got in construction is how we're actually structured. We have a subcontracting model. We have tens of thousands of small firms who compete really vigorously for work off, main contractors and others.
Yep.
And the prices screw down so low that the kind of the contracting signals that we send to those sub-trades, where most of the work is actually and the training is actually done, is I just simply can't afford to train. I've signed up for a year's supply of work through this particular head contractor. I've got to make as much money as I can. I'm not taking anybody on because they're going to slow me down and I'm going to lose my margin. Yep. And there was work done by PwC about 4 years ago that looked at this system and said, as a result of that, there are some really good outcomes when it comes to consumers. They get a competitive price, etc. But there are some casualties, some unintended consequences of which, lack of innovation, lack of research and development, lack of communication, lack of cooperation. And whilst training wasn't in that mix, it is exactly a casualty of that model. So to some degree, we're the masters of our own problem.
Yeah,
we have to change our own ways in order to address that.
That ultimately killed productivity and actual output as an industry anyway, right? Because we were choked by shortage of labour, shortage of skills. So it might have had some short-term benefits, but long-term it didn't work for us.
No.
We ended up in a rough spot. Who then has the ability, who within the industry has the ability to look at the big picture and provide guidance and steering in that space?
Well, work specifies for a start. So essentially, the old golden rule: she who has the gold makes the rules. So if you're operating on those razor-thin margins and you're compromising training, you're compromising productivity, you're compromising health and safety, getting away from the razor-thin margins is a pretty good start.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the VET system that Toby and I are involved in, the vocational education and training system, isn't an easy system to interface with if you're an employer. Only about 10% of firms train at any one time, simply because, economic pressures and that margin pressure, and the contracting signals that sends, along with it's quite bureaucratic to train in a way that easily interacts with you as a company and makes an individual progress through a formal, through the education process.
Yeah.
And so making that more attractive for firms will help. Making that interface easier will help. And dismantling the competition that exists between ITOs and between polytechs. We're all funded on the basis of how many apprentices we have. Therefore, we don't share, we don't collaborate, because it's not in our interest to.
Yeah.
So whilst we might benefit because we've got more apprentices than you have, the sector as a whole doesn't benefit.
Yeah.
And so what Toby mentioned earlier, the reforms of vocational education are designed to try and address some of those problems, which are long overdue. And that might have been okay 30 years ago, but it's not okay today.
Toby, do you have other thoughts in there in terms of your space, or?
Well, I certainly share Warwick's views that the reforms that are in play now are making a difference. They're getting us away from that unnecessarily competitive model. And it does create the opportunity for collaboration, which we need more of, for the vocational education sector to act as one rather than a whole lot of competing factions, and therefore to deliver far better, less bureaucratic outcomes. And again, all credit to the officials. What we're seeing now is already a much more sort of creative outcome-focused approach to vocational education, particularly in the post-COVID world. And how do we deliver better outcomes for employers so they're not tangled up in our paperwork?
Okay, and so before we move on, if you could have waved a magic wand and done one thing to try and fix the issues of the last few years, what would you have done?
There isn't a silver bullet here, right? And that's the thing. You can't just kind of flick a switch and all of a sudden it changes.
Yep.
I think from a paradigm perspective, that for too long the government has considered employers as, well, they've got to train anyway, so they're just, they've got to do it. And they freeload off the goodwill of employers. So firms train so they can be competitive, so they can get a competitive advantage, so they can be productive, right?
Yep.
They don't have to train to give somebody a national certificate.
Yeah.
And so the added inconvenience, if you like, of doing that is totally personalised for the firm. Yeah. So as long as we continue to treat firms as, oh, they're over there doing something else, and they're not an equal partner in the vocational system, because the firm is the teacher. It's the only teacher that doesn't get support. Every other tertiary education gets gets paid or supported. Then we're going to continue to have a system that's disaggregated from the employer's perspective, because the employers are another beast. They're not. They should be treated as a provider. We call them providers if you're a teacher, just like polytechs, the universities, the wānangas, the private training establishments, or the ITOs. They are an equal partner in that process.
Yeah. I mean, it seemed like it was, it seemed like the other thing was that it was all too late. by the time the work had ramped up to the peak that it was at, the pipeline wasn't there. There was a handful of guys who had stayed committed. Maybe they didn't do it for commercial reasons. Maybe they just knew it was the right thing to do, but they'd stayed committed to an apprenticeship program and keeping that flow on. But a lot of them, by the time they had all of that work, it was too late to start the training process, right? Which is why it's so critical that we now turn to this next few years and go, what do we need to do in the next few years so that they're already trained when the work peaks, not trying to train them then.
Yeah, and one of the kind of key elements to that, which we
just frozen there, or is it just me?
arc kind of going, we know there's 156 billion worth of projects that have been proposed, but the longer we wait, the more people are going to be laid off because they've got no certainty.
Correct.
So that's the big challenge.
And we saw that in Christchurch, because after the Christchurch earthquake, there was about a 2-year gap before the work started flowing. But we all knew that we're going to be overrun with work. Yeah. And we kept saying to the government, look, we need program. Because firms were going, we can't train or employ on a promise, Warwick. We need the work. It's all very well for you. You don't have to pay these people. So you need the work, but you also need a system that sees it coming and can train and have people ready and willing. And that's the bit that's always missing in the past.
Yeah. And there's been a release of funding, and there's been commitments to further training. Is there the right places for it to go?
Well, yeah, I mean, not entirely in the sense, and kind of repeating that same point. If we're not clear on what the projects are and where those projects are going to be, then it's a great deal harder to know what we should be training people on. So you've almost got, at the moment, almost a two-speed system. So in the vocational education space, the funding is being released swiftly, and there's pretty good clarity on how it's supposed to be applied. And we're seeing that all turning around in the last month or so. But in terms of the actual projects and the $3 billion COVID recovery fund, that's now been 2 months since the Infrastructure Industry Reference Group was created. We know, we're hearing that some projects have got the red light, but it's not clear who's yet got the green light. So you've got this kind of two speeds of now the funding's available, the willingness is there from the ITOs like Warwick and mine and the 9 others, and indeed from the ITPs, from this new New Zealand Institute. So we're kind of there, we're ready and willing, but where do we direct it to?
Yeah. And in a residential space where, I mean, there's got to be something that people can be putting their hands to. It might take a little while for, just lost Warwick.
Rock's gone dark.
Yeah, no, my video cuts out, and it seems to be okay if I don't have video on, that's all. So you all froze for me for a minute.
Yeah, sorry. I mean, there's probably going to be a lag before developers and people start innovating and getting clever about what they're delivering for this new market, because there's going to be a bit of a lag in working out what the heck is this new market and what does it need and what do we build for them. But surely there's stuff we can have people putting their hands to in the meantime.
Yeah, so we're trying to do 2 things. Firstly, we're trying to build a system whereby we can catch those apprentices that become casualties of the next 2 years, because of lack of work, they get laid off.
Yep.
We don't want that training to go to waste. We know that we'll want them back again when the market recovers. We just don't know when. So we're trying to build a bridge, and we don't know when the other side of that bridge is. So if we can catch those apprentices and redeploy them, but allow them to continue with their training, and now that there's free fees, that won't be a barrier, and they might be working somewhere else in the construction sector, like in Toby's area, because he's got $139 billion worth of work.
somewhere.
So they might be still in construction, in the wider construction system, but they continue with their tiling qualification.
Yep.
So that when the tiling market responds again, they can go back. All right. The other side is trying to grow the pipeline from people who are coming out of schools, who are being redirected as, through the student pathway, which is in through the polytechs. Now, again, it's difficult to get people from the polytech system into work when there's no work. So again, it's a bridge. So we try to bring them in through that formal training mechanism and actually giving them an apprenticeship, not doing a pre-trade. So they're actually doing an apprenticeship in the classroom in conjunction with real life experience. So that when they get, midway, partway through or towards the end, hopefully the market's recovered. So we don't have that massive shortfall because we've got them trained through another mechanism, and we won't therefore have to rely on immigration to fill that void. But again, it's like cooking. You got to get all the ingredients timed right. And as Toby said, if there's no work, what happens to them?
Yeah.
But in the absence of doing nothing, we'll get what we've always got.
Yeah. Yeah. And the risk is that Australia does have the work and we lose them all over there.
True.
So how does that sound on your end, Toby? Do you think that sort of thing can work with this kind of cross-sharing of training in this space, but working in this space and getting a broader understanding, but keeping the money flowing?
I don't see why not. Yeah. I think there's any number of core skills which are applicable across multiple sectors. Even just simple stuff like health and safety training or site preparedness or whatever. There's also simply that I suppose the art of being trained, of getting people into that mode of you've got some paperwork to do and you've got to take photos of the things that you've completed and the achievements you've made, and just understanding that learning is a journey. You may have some branches that go off along the way.
So if they were able to come out to you tomorrow and say, okay, well, here's the 139 million projects.
It'll only be 3 billion, just to be clear, that they've selected out of the.
Yeah. So you got people ready to be trained, but not necessarily finished the training to execute the projects. Is that right?
I think the concern right now, given that I think both construction and infrastructure sectors have historically been under-resourced and seeking more skilled workers, is we have this dip while we're waiting to find out what happens, and we potentially lose some more workers, and then we have the spike. We've got to bring them all back. The idea is to try and minimise that gap.
But the workers are there.
Well, I mean, are there sufficient workers now? No. But we could be redeploying them out of other sectors that are facing a downturn.
Yeah.
The biggest challenge for us is if you're an apprentice or you're a worker and you get laid off, you don't become a student because you can't afford to. Because you might have a family and a mortgage and kids and all that sort of stuff. Because you're a worker, you can't afford to go back to polytech or university and study full time. So that pathway is quite different from the student pathway where you've left school, you've gone into in an institution, you learn your skill, and then you go to work. That's quite different. So trying to divert workers into a learning institution like a polytech is going to be nigh on impossible.
Yeah.
But there's no reason why they can't continue their learning while they're working in other sectors.
Yeah.
And that's going to be the challenge, though. What's the incentive if you're halfway through a carpentry qualification and you're ending up planting trees for conservation?
Yeah.
Because that's all you could get. What's the incentive for you to carry on your learning? That's the challenge for us.
Is the training program able to adapt to that so that, because a lot of the learning was done on site.
Yeah.
Now what he's doing in his day job is planting trees. So what he then learns in the classroom or online needs to look different as well. Is that there yet or needs to happen? Or?
Yeah, we're building it now. So we're working really closely with the polytechs to try and develop a system where that can happen. And from a theory perspective, that isn't too difficult because you can do your bookwork online, you can do it, at night, you've already got your material.
Yep.
It's getting access to the practical work experience where you can actually have to apply and prove your skill is likely to be the challenge. But we're working with Kaingaora and the Polytechs and Tamaki Redevelopment and others to see what work experience that they can provide access to.
Yeah. Where does the innovation need to happen, and what are some of the innovations that you guys have, some of the ideas you guys have to do things differently going forward?
I think that the simplest potential for innovation is much closer collaboration between employers, vocational education sector, and officials in terms of how we can apply vocational training. Both as Warwick refers to in terms of creating something which is a bit more adaptable. And I think in combining both online learning, classroom-based learning and practical learning in a way that doesn't see you shuttled between all sorts of different providers, but sees you going through one integrated process.
How do you de-risk it for the employers to get that engagement?
I think almost by definition, the nature of what you're trying to do, which is to say to the employer, let us take some of this load off you, let's understand the outcome that you want to achieve, and we'll put the parts together to deliver that to you. So from an employer's perspective, it is de-risked. The purpose would be de-risking. And for the trainee's perspective, there's a lot more certainty for the learner. It's just a bit more work for vocational education and for all of us to build better relationships.
Yep. Is there platforms for that, or does there need to be some kind of platform, some kind of something to actually physically get the people together? Because at the moment, you wait for an employer to contact you, right? There's no, if he hasn't got a job or looking for an apprentice, then he's not really talking to you, is he?
Yeah, so we need to build a world, and the ITOs are much better at this because we are employer focused, right? They're our client.
Yeah.
We need to build a vet education system that is responsive to the individual needs of the firm and the individual needs of the learner. We can't have a one size fits all because it simply doesn't. So we need to be able to customize right down to that granular level how it fits with the firm and how it fits with that individual. Yep. And it happens to us now, right? We go along and we say to the firm, well, when do you want to see us? And they go, well, don't come on a Monday because it's the first day of the week and it's really busy. Don't come on a Friday afternoon because we're wrapping up for the week and we're really busy. Tuesday's payday and we're always flat out. And Busby says, okay, so if you come on a Wednesday, actually, don't come on Wednesday morning. Can you come Wednesday afternoon? Actually, it's best between 2 and 3. And so we do.
Yeah.
Right? Now, if you go into an institutional system, you have to try and respond to what they want. And there's no way that you're going to do that. And if you think about how society has moved, the expectations on you around you learn when you want to, you learn in the manner you want to, and you learn at the speed you want to. If you go to Amazon and you order something online and they treat you like they did with, if you went into a department store or Netflix, you just sign off, right? The locus of control is with the individual now. And it's over to the provider to respond to that need, not the other way around. And so if we're still trying to ram down employers and apprentices' throats, this is how it will happen, we'll lose them.
What about, is there a way that we can break things down and create kind of micro skills and micro training? So rather than trying to, get this guy completely certified as a carpenter, he is just trained in standing and straightening frames, for example. And it's a quick, short course. And then you go, bang, we've got 20 guys that are skilled in this. They're employable. They're ready to go. And then while they're doing that, they can go do another micro course. Is there capacity for stuff like that?
Yeah, and it happens now. So that micro credentials or stackable credentials was introduced about a couple of years ago. and there
Is it
some,
that small, or is it that?
it varies on the program. I think the minimum microcredits could be nothing smaller than 10 credits.
Right.
I think it's 10 credits,
Yeah.
Toby. And anything over 40 credits is considered a qualification.
Where does the 10 credits come from? How does that get decided as a level?
That's the NZQA rule. They just
Right.
make it rule. Right.
Is it helpful? Could we do it differently? Toby's grinning.
Of course, we could do it differently with the right will.
Yeah.
It's
Biting your
interesting.
tongue. I'm dying to know what you're thinking.
Okay, so this is part of the background to it. So carpentry or construction, for example, is very specialised now. We've got firms just doing certain things.
Yep.
And traditionally, the firm did the lot. The carpenter did, say, carpentry, did the lot. Now we've got people just doing standing up frames. We've got people just doing foundations, people just installing windows, people just putting in jib, people just doing roofing, right?
Yeah.
And they had specialised markets. In the old days, all that work was done by the builder. Yeah. Now, so the full carpentry qualification is still very relevant because there are lots of people that do that. However, as the market has specialised and become more competitive, what's the point of doing a full carpentry qual if you're just going to install jib board or put up structural jib or just install windows? You need a qualification that specialises just in that. So we call that a micro-credential. There was some pushback by people in the sector going, oh, you're going to undermine our existing full apprentice. We don't want that. And we go, that's ridiculous. We're accessing a market that we currently can't access.
Yeah.
Because they can't sign into a program they haven't got the scope of work for.
Yeah. And
so
it's
there's some old guy who think it's the world's coming to an end. True.
Yeah.
And it's quite funny because you say to these people, okay, how do you run your business? Well, they have all these subcontractors doing just that.
Yeah.
But they still want the fully rounded carpenter. Well, do you?
Paying a margin on that guy.
Well.
Yeah. Interesting. So then perhaps what's attractive to them is the liability or the level of hands-off or not having to manage that guy if they're subbing it out to a subcontractor. So is there space to provide assistance in that area? Again, de-risking and helping on the liability side of things, because that is a real concern if you're hiring a relatively fresh skilled person.
Yeah, so contracting, to make money as a contractor, you need to be a really good project manager.
Yep.
Right? Material prices are much the same, labour prices are much the same. It's your ability to put all the moving parts together as efficiently and as economically as possible is where you make your money. And so the oversight and management of that and the quality control associated with that is desperately missing in New Zealand. And we really need really good quality project managers, construction managers, supervisors and foremen, etc., whose job is to do that and make sure that the putting together of all the components in a building are put together well and effectively and efficiently, because if you don't do that, you'll lose money.
So, but is what makes an effective project manager somebody who's been through it all and technically knows how to do it all themselves and now they're overseeing it? Or is it somebody with the right people and communication skills to be able to manage that side of things?
I'll pass that to Toby.
Well, I would say it's more the latter. It's not to be an effective project manager. It's not critical that you are an expert in all the facets that you're overseeing. I think it's far better that you're going back to those principles of efficiency, understanding the customer need, understanding what's critical. We're seeing examples of contractors, subcontractors, and principals all up in arms over an error. And for instance, in say connecting a wastewater to a stormwater drain, and you wind up with paralysis because nobody wants to take responsibility. Well, what you need to do is fix the problem. and then get on with it. A decent project manager would address that rather than worrying about liability, which I think is all too often on people's minds.
Yeah. Where do you guys see, in your part of the industry that you see, where do you see the big holes in productivity? Potentially not even just talking skills, from your guys' perspective and the way that you engage with contractors and see sites and businesses operate, where do you see some of the holes in productivity?
I think it's poor management.
Hmm.
So I did some work on this a few years ago and presented at a couple of conferences and looked at, because productivity in construction is a dirty word around the world,
Mm-hmm.
Construction productivity is really poor. When you compare it to the motor industry, there's a lack of technology and a lack of this and a lack of that. Well, we're not the motor industry, right? And so it's an unfair comparison. But if you look at a well-run construction site, and they're both building the same building next door to each other, and you've got the same workers with the same design and the same materials, etc. It's all around how well you and efficiently you run that site. You can be. So I know that there was some research done in America between American workers and Japanese workers, and the Japanese worker is no more productive than the American worker at an individual level. It's the system they work within that makes them productive, right? They've only got capacity for so many, to doing so many things an hour and so many hours in the day. But it's how you put all those bits together is where you are productive or less productive.
So do you think then that the training organisations have the right programs to be taking people with other skills and getting them to that point, so that we've got some really highly skilled project managers ready to go? Yep.
Yes. So sort of the progression of an apprentice is, you start an apprentice, in the first year or two, you're not that necessarily that productive. After a couple of years, you can work on your own. The good ones, when they're 3/4 of the way through, often get picked up by their boss and go, oh, you can be a foreman now and run that site. And then as they progress, they might be running several sites. And then they might progress to another level. So if you look at the qualifications that are available to you, they get progressively higher up the framework, the qualifications framework. So you end up with construction management degrees and these sorts of things. And what that does is it lifts the individual's area of control to be a lot higher and broader, but your timeframes are also a lot further out. So if you're on a residential site, you might have a time frame of, I don't know, maybe a week, 2 weeks. When you're a construction manager and you're managing a major building, it might be 5 years. So as you go up, you get broader and deeper in that understanding, and that's all there now. But it's a matter of, I think we have a challenge as a construction sector to have that formal process kind of available and those pathways really clear for people.
Can we fast track it, and can we, assuming there's less work in the next few years, can we still get the training in more of an off-site model so that they're still progressing even though they're not growing naturally?
Yes, and I think Toby will agree, because we believe that there's room for a degree apprenticeship, particularly in construction, where, we talked before about, people generally like to have somebody with construction skills. If you're looking after a $200 million job, right, you can't afford to make errors because you have major problems. But you can't afford necessarily to go to university when you're 30 years old to study as a construction manager. And in the UK and in other parts of the world, they're introducing degree apprenticeships, where firms are partnering with universities to make those available. So the firm is offering the degree while you're working. So you're not a student in the formal way of someone doing a degree, and that's becoming more common. And I believe it's quite appropriate in that construction space for the very reason we've talked about.
I think this comes back to your earlier question around productivity, and what does New Zealand as a nation value? And I know it's a topic that's dear to Warwick's heart, but it's this sort of perception that university degree is the ultimate that we should be aiming for, and it's valued more highly than some of the trade outcomes. And I'm sitting here with a whole bunch of books behind me because my father and grandfather were both academics, and my son said to me, Dad, would you really let me do a trade? It's like, absolutely I would. We can't keep on pumping people out into a world where there's no demand for the services or the learning that they've got. And we do that involuntarily by putting something on a pedestal and putting something else down as less valuable. Starting off as a lollipop person on the stop go signs, that still leads to an amazing career, and it leads to a great deal more productivity than perhaps my degree in economic history did.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost a criminal offence, Tim, to have a person come out of school with NCEA level 3, spend 4 years doing a complicated apprenticeship. It could be motor engineering, it could be carpentry, it could be something else, and get level 4. When you go to university, you get a degree in underwater macrame and get level 7. That is outrageous. And if you look at the graduate outcomes and the profiles, when you're reading what those two things are, they look exactly the same. You would not know that they are different. Yet here we are as a country ranking it 3 shops below, 3 levels below a degree. So we're reinforcing that prejudice that Toby mentioned. It's outrageous.
Yeah. Is the funding there? So is there a funding model that's not quite working if we're coming into a time where the employers aren't in a position to support? Is there a way that something can be tied over? Obviously, the education part of it can be covered, but is there any gaps there that need to be dealt with?
We are moving into a new kind of world of vocational education funding, particularly spurred on by the COVID-19 response. So I think historically, I'd certainly argue very strongly that the funding model was broken. That was also had a one rate of funding for one part of the system and a much lower rate of funding for the IDOs. Made no sense. Didn't then, still doesn't. But what we're moving towards, I think, is something which is a great deal more level-headed and recognises that it's the outcome that matters, and recognises that it's the employer that matters because they ultimately are training these people.
Yeah, there is, and I agree with Toby on that one. Whether or not we pay employers outright, I think needs to be explored, because if firms are just going to be paid to train with no good education outcomes, then you may not be any further down the track. South Korea looked at this a few years ago because they were considered highly effective, highly innovative, and they were ranked really highly on the OECD framework because of that. Because they sent everybody to university, right? They said, look, university's the future here. 90% of their kids went to uni. 20 years later, they're coming out with PhDs and masters and haven't got jobs. They've got no one to build their infrastructure. They're importing people from India and all over the world to build their roads, hospitals, and bridges. And they said, we got it wrong. We got it utterly wrong. And so they were doing a tour of the world a few years ago and looking at the best apprenticeship systems because they were going to put one in for the first time in their 2,000-year history. And they came to New Zealand and they had a look and they said, we like your system. We like the fact that you have kind of ITOs that support firms, but anybody can train. Any firm can do it. And so you're not getting good education outcomes. And they decided that they would be a lot more structured and rigorous in their approach. And they were going to support firms so much. I think it was $15,000 US a year per trainee, because it was cheaper than putting into university at $50,000 a year, right? But you had to meet certain criteria in order for you to take on an apprentice, because you had to teach them properly, not just make the money. And so I think there's a balance between the two. And so we want to make our firms expert teachers. That's our challenge. Not every firm. If we double the number of firms, that would be plenty.
Yep.
So I think there's something there between support and funding that we need to unpick to figure out what that combination of support looks like.
In it, this is where the innovation piece has to constantly come in, because it doesn't always just have to be one or the other. There's got to be all sorts of different ways that you can skin that cat, be it cost sharing, delayed payment, or things like, at the end of the day, you've got a student loan, or maybe the student loan goes against the company and then they get that back afterwards once the guy's up and running and working, or something along those lines. There's got to be other ways that can be done.
Yep, indeed. And different firms will have different needs, right? And this is this customized model. So if you're an Air New Zealand or a McDonald's or someone that has a significant, HR and training system, because you're large and you're sophisticated, you're going to have different needs than the small construction company with 4 staff. So you need to have a system that recognizes the different options and how people function. And if Air New Zealand is highly sophisticated in what they do, why can't they be treated as an institution like an ITO? Be subject to review like we are about being able to do what we do. This is where you're starting to treat the employer as a genuine teacher in the system, a genuine partner in vocational learning. There's no reason why you can't do that. We get a warrant to offer. Every 4 years we get reviewed, and if we don't meet the standard, we lose our warrant. Why can't a firm have the same approach?
Yeah.
No different. It's a philosophical kind of argument here.
So is there anything you want to say to the industry, assuming there's a bunch of builders and architects that are going to be tuning in and listening? Is there any messages that you guys have to the industry?
I think our message would be, let's get together. If they're feeling the pain, let us see what we can do to help. Let us make sure that we've got a combined voice, and let's find out where the investment's going to be happening so that we can support them to keep their trainees on and keep on investing in New Zealand.
Yeah, and I think mine is we are going through a tough time, and it's going to get tougher with COVID. At the same time, the tertiary education institutions in relation to vocational learning are going to be restructured and pulled apart and put back together again. If we manage those two things well and we get to the other side, we will be in a much better place.
Yep.
And we have an opportunity with the reforms to really build something that's best for New Zealand. And we don't want to lose the confidence in the hearts and minds of firms while that happens, because if we do that, we'll go back a decade like we did in the 90s. And so the challenge for us is to make sure that we don't do that, because the opportunity, the apple on the other side is way better than the apple on this side.
Yep. Yeah, and I think the difficulty going forward is there's going to be a lot of winners and losers, and there's going to be some in some parts of the industry, or just like if you look at construction, anyone that's building for Kaingaora, probably going to be flat out. And if you haven't managed to tap into some of that work, then you're going to be potentially struggling, But again, as an industry, how do you come together?
Yeah. But, pat ourselves on the back. Construction has managed these boom busts now forever. And we're really highly resilient as an industry to cope with these wild swings in activity. It swings much more than any other sector. And then training in our sector swings even more. So we are highly resilient because of that. And that's another reason why we're structured the way we are. We don't carry massive overheads because we've all subcontracted everything else. So it has consequences, obviously, but so we are resilient, and we can't be too negative on ourselves, and we'll get through this. We always do.
Yep. Great. Any final thoughts, or potentially anything that each of you would say to each other from the two different parts of the industry and being in the same game but in a different space? Do you guys have any advice for each other that you I'm just going to put it out there as an opportunity to fire one across the bow, but in a constructive way.
Yeah, I do. I think, and Toby and I get on really well with, you know, our ITAs have signed an MOU to work together. It's for the best of the sector, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Toby looks after a different part of the sector. And for me, if we try and catch, you know, if apprentices fall out of the bit that I look after, and we can't redeploy them into other roles in my part of the world, keeping them in the wider construction ecosystem, we have a much better chance of hanging on to them than if they go off, you know, shooting rabbits and planting trees for conservation. And I think if we can keep that connection going, then we have a much greater chance of keeping these people together so that we can access them later.
Yeah, agreed. And I think, Tim, it's quite like a quality home. And as you know, they start with quality ingredients. So we just want to maintain the quality.
Good as gold.
Pleasure.
Nice for the invite. Thanks for your time.
Great to have
Cheers,
you.
Tim.
Cheers.
Cheers,
Thanks.
guys. Bye.